Hello, welcome to the Physicians of Culture podcast. My name's Glenn McLaren. I'm a philosopher at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm here with my co-host, Arran Gare, also from Swinburne. Hi, Arran. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Today we're talking about technology. So, quite a big topic these days. When I was first researching early, doing my PhD, my main focus was on health and health issues, particularly the obesity crisis. But then I did your course. I remember doing your course as an undergraduate called Philosophy, Media, Culture, which gave some amazing insights into the nature of technology, and particularly into the problems of abstract thought, which was focused mainly on information technology. And then, of course, I had the privilege of you handing that course over to me to teach. I've been teaching it now for, I think about since the late 2000s. And I remember back there, around 2010, I got asked to do a talk, an Occam's Razor talk on Radio National on internet addiction. Because I'd alerted someone to that to the fact that they were talking about internet addiction on radio. And I wrote in and said, look, I take this course on philosophy, media, culture, which is really an antidote to internet addiction. And so they invited me to give this talk. And then after that, I embarked on writing a paper and publishing a paper on the triumph of virtual reality and its impact on philosophy and civilization. Because I started to realise that back then, in the late 2000s, I started to get a sense of how this new technology of the internet, the digital technology, could actually have some deleterious consequences on learning and on the development of civilization and on philosophy as well, in terms of the development of people's capacities to think philosophically. So I wrote that paper. That paper has then become sort of the basis of that course, as well as your paper that you wrote not long after that, I don't think, on the grand narrative of re-embodiments, where you're looking at that issue as well. And it's been interesting in my paper on virtual reality. I looked at some of the research at the time about some of the bad effects of engaging with digital technology. And part of that was McGilchrist too, of effects on with the right and left hemisphere of the brain, etc. And effects on people getting addicted to it, and effects on what Nicholas Carr called a sort of an ecology of distraction, where people are losing the ability, for instance, to engage their long-term memory and engage in deep concept formation. Instead, they're hunters and gatherers of data, just using their short-term memory.
Yeah.
And I remember putting to this, getting my students to read this back in the early 2000s. About after 2012. And getting quite a lot of pushback from them, because they would say to me, you're just an old bloke, and what would you? This is our world.
Yeah.
Digital world is our world, and we know what it's like, and we love it, and you're just pouring a bucket of cold water over it all. Things have changed a lot. I just started teaching that course today, and the students, having read that paper, react to it very differently now. Instead of seeing it as a challenge to their world, which they cherish and they enjoy and they love, they're now starting to say, oh my God, I can see the problems that I have with digital technology, and I can see the problems I have with my information technology, and how it's impacting my life, and how it's preventing me from getting a good education in many ways. So I guess that's what I want to talk about a little bit, or we want to talk about a little bit today, about the impacts of technology. In particular, I think one of the most important critiques of technology that comes out in your work, and mine now, of course, is the problem of the instrumental view of technology, and the idea that there is only sort of a one-way relationship where we have mastery over it. And I became very interested in the whole field of phenomenology when I was back doing my PhD, and getting that sense in which, even these objects, even these seemingly inert material objects, actually impact on us in significant ways as well as we use them, and they change us as we use them. So then I see media, for instance. Media, they become media in the sense in which they come between us and our world, and they change our perception of the world in a similar way to these pair of glasses do.
Yeah.
And the challenge with technology is for us to be able to, for the technology to be visible to us in such a way as we're able to reflect on what impacts it's having on us as we use it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. The problem we've got, I think, as Alf Hornborg pointed out, is we've got a fetishism of technology, which means that you're blind to the context. You take it for granted that we have to have technological progress as though we're not responsible for that. And then if you think about technology, because it's so pervasive, we're like, fish in water, unaware that what water is.
Yeah, that's right,
The technology is, we've transformed the world. I mean, just about everything we do is mediated by very complex forms of technology, which we have in the past tended to take for granted as somehow advancing humanity. But when you look at it more closely, it turns out to be really problematic. What you're mostly focusing on was what Walter Ong called the technologization of the word.
That's right, yeah.
The development of, writing to begin with, then later on the printing press, then electronic media, associated with radio, television. Now we've got the internet and all those sort of things. And these have huge impacts, not just on the organisation of society, because the way you communicate largely determines how society is organised, but on how people think. And this is what Walter Ong showed, with the development of literacy, people developed the capacity to think much more abstractly. But the printing press, again, made major changes. And he was pointing out problematic aspects of that. That is that you get abstract thinking, but also you tend to lose the immediacy associated with oral communication.
That's right, yeah. That's one of the most fascinating things about that course, I think, is getting the students to delve into the nature of an oral culture.
That's right, yeah.
Distinguishing an oral culture from a literate culture, and appreciating it, appreciating what we gain from becoming literate creatures, but also appreciating what it is we lose in the process of doing that.
With literacy, to begin with, before you had the printing press, when writing had to be copied, you still had a major role for oral culture. So medieval universities, you had debates and so on. What we're getting now is something really peculiar, a real elimination of oral culture. You think about how tutorials are often eliminated from universities. That's where you discuss what you've read, and you interrelate, different media, oral media and print media.
So does that contradict what Ong was talking about in regard to secondary orality, or is that in line with what he was talking about?
I think that was in line with it, but he was writing before the real development of digital technology took off.
That's right, yeah.
What you're getting now is something more problematic, and it seems to be restructuring people's brains, how the brains work. And a lot of the achievements, the various things that were being criticised in the past, like writing being problematic because it led to this very abstract thinking. Now we're losing the abstract thinking, but we're also losing the immediacy associated with oral culture as well. So what do you get? This fragmented thinking associated with just bits of information.
Yeah, and as you say, people losing the ability to communicate orally. And
That's right, yes.
Express themselves. And any erosion in people's ability to be able to express themselves is always damaging.
It is, yeah.
It can be damaging to mental health as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, the notion of express, it's the opposite of impress. So somehow your mind is going out into the world, expressing yourself. We wonder now whether people have minds. The conditions for people developing a mind of their own is disappearing.
Well, that's right, and central to that is the notion of abstract thought, and the book that we use in that course Michael Hobart and Zachary Schiffman, Information Ages, I think talks about abstract thought in a really interesting way.
It does,
As that sort of two-step process of being able to separate something out from the world and out from the flux of experience. Then having removed it and separated it, you can then have an object by which that you can manipulate.
Yeah, okay, we can do that. And you can see that abstract thought has made huge advances because of that ability to abstract.
Well, it's the condition for us to be here, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. Now, what we're getting with digital technology, I mean, you have very highly developed abstract thought to develop, the very idea of digital technology, the kind of logic, Boolean logic that underpins it all, the development of the machines to process it, computers and the like. So you get this very small number of people who are involved in developing this, but the notion of information has changed. So that the original notion of informing means taking on the form of something. So you inform because you're changed by virtue of your, being impacted by knowledge, wisdom, or whatever. Now information has come to be conceived of as bits of information equivalent to negative entropy that's then processed by information processing machines. And people have come to see themselves as nothing but information processing mechanisms.
Which reflects that mechanical view of the world.
It does, but it's to a higher degree because the information is fetishized as though these bits of information exist in isolation from any context. You don't need a context to understand what the supposed information is meant to be conveying. You just process it.
That's right, and that's what
manipulate it.
I remember. That's what Nicholas Carr was talking about the sort of the idea that we are becoming data processors, and that's what I see in universities these days too. I see, universities seem to be places where a whole collection of people are engaged in collecting data.
That's right. I mean, they've redefined.
I often wonder whether they ever ask themselves why they're doing it.
Yeah, they do this because they've redefined what science is, and they're influenced by, they're not aware of it, by logical positivism. The idea that you have atomic facts which correspond to what's in the world. I mean, the propositions are true because they correspond to these facts. This is based on logical atomism.
And the more facts you have, the more true something is.
Or you just accumulate facts and you organise them and process them. The thing is that we've embodied that philosophy, which is shown to be really problematic, in fact, basically wrong when it comes to understanding what science is, embodied it in our technology, and then the technology forms us so that we take this for granted, this philosophical doctrine that's actually fundamentally defective. But it was shown to be fundamentally defective, particularly by philosophers of science, who, when they looked at the history of science, said, well, science isn't just collecting data, it's getting insight into the nature of reality. Yeah. And you need a lot of imagination. Well, there's no place for imagination in this world of processing bits of information. So the universes get transformed so that research is about collecting data, perhaps constructing mathematical models to make prediction. And as a consequence of that, science itself is being wrecked.
And as I said in an earlier podcast, that then leads to asking a scientist, well, what does your data mean? And them blanking at you and saying, oh, well, I leave that to philosophers.
Yeah. One of the things that's being eliminated is stories. And when you appreciate that, you realise that stories are the basic ways in which humans have developed to orient themselves in the world over and above, grappling with immediate situations. It's by virtue of stories that we're able to cooperate in very complex ways, develop ideas about the continuity of our communities that transcend individuals, that pre-exist them and exist after they're dead. And people got meaning in their lives through having that sense of being part of a community which is bigger than themselves. Well, once you've destroyed narratives, destroyed the capacity for people to think in terms of stories, they're just not aware of that anymore. Life itself becomes meaningless fragments.
And I remember the neuroscientist Susan Greenfield wrote about that. She wrote a book about arguing that digital technology was destroying our capacity for storytelling. It was destroying our capacity for being able to see ourselves in a continuum from the past to the present to the future.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is supported by Ian McGilchrist's work on how the brain functions and how the contribution of the right hemisphere, which he argues is more important because it's holistic, it's open to new experiences and so on, gets blocked out by the left hemisphere, which is just like mechanical processing.
Now, stories is a really good example of how information technology works, I think, and the process of abstraction. Because, and also a little bit towards to what Ong was talking about in regard to secondary orality, because with information technology, you have the ability to store your thoughts in a more enduring form, and so you can take a story these days and you can upload it into an information technology, or you can write it down on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And then you have, as I said, you have that object that you can then manipulate. And so you can self-consciously manipulate stories and you can structure them in very complex ways. I remember Ong saying things about the fact that, it would be impossible for an oral culture, for instance, to write a complex detective story because you have to be able to separate out all of the parts and then find ways of bringing them all together. It's a very complex process.
Yeah.
And so that's the way in which, but then the problem is that we use that capacity to manipulate stories in such a way as you say, we end up destroying story.
That's right.
Destroying the
yeah.
significance.
And if you look at the development of that technologisation of the word, as Ong put it, the development of literacy enabled people to produce much better histories. So you had, in a sense, the birth of real history then.
Yeah.
People interrogated the stories about the past. You moved on from mythical thinking to trying to get truth in your stories, like in the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. With the printing press, you had an explosion of the development of history and also the development of the novel, because you could write it down, you construct more complex stories. So you had this evolution of better and better history. Well, what's happened to the historians now? I mean, they're being marginalised from universities, and the people are no longer storing their so-called knowledge or whatever in a way that enables them to connect things, and in particular to connect things through as stories, so that they lose any sense of context.
Because we've become better at being to access little atoms of information.
That's right, yeah.
Of history, yeah.
Yeah, and so people have not the ability to understand developing traditions of thought.
It's almost like a problem associated with our categorizing potential. Going back to Aristotle, I guess. The information technology gives us the capacity to better categorize things and organize knowledge in a way. But then it takes away from us some of that spontaneity, or some of that ability. It becomes too controlled in some sense, and we don't see what other possibilities are around us in some ways.
That's right. I mean, what you had with the printing press to some extent was associated with the mechanical view of the world, but at the same time you had historical understanding of the development of ideas by people like Vico, who pointed out that this was a new way of thinking that was questionable. People in the past didn't have the categories that dominate current modern society. But with the development of information technology, the ability to contextualize that historically gets eliminated. So we get locked into a certain set of categories, which we're blind to, with the possibility of questioning those and coming up with better categories. So the mechanical view of the world gets entrenched in a way that places it beyond questioning, because you can't question it if you just think of it in terms of bits of information. And the very idea of bits of information is really problematic. But getting back to the initial issue of technology and us swimming within it, the thing about that is that we're living in a world that's more and more dominated by autonomous technology that we've lost control over. And this is, looking back to our previous series, parts of the series, driving us to global ecological destruction. And people aren't able to see the connections between all the different aspects of our society that are driving that destruction, because they've lost that ability to put things in context. And one of the things that you can see is, the way in which we've got a cargo cult where we take for granted, all the goods that appear on our supermarket shelves, not realising that this is based on exploiting people in third world countries, destroying their environments and what have you.
Yeah, once again, that's that problem of abstraction, isn't it? And things becoming removed from their original context, which as process philosophers we understand as a more dynamic, complex context.
Yeah.
And then being in many ways sort of simplified. What abstraction can do as well. And then you have abstractions being built on abstractions. So you get further, and it's a bit like having an argument with someone and then writing down a transcript of the argument and then distributing that argument around to a whole bunch of different people. And then the further removed you get from the original act,
the original context,
the more it loses any sense. Well, and this is what happens in like chat rooms online these days, isn't it? You'll get the first couple of posts that will refer to the actual article that was being written, and the rest of it is people referring or having a go at each other. It gets further and further removed from but it's worse than that, because it gets further and further removed from reality, such that our machines are starting to be seen as primary, and the complex natural contexts from which they emerge are being lost.
That's right. And so you get this sense in which people are living in a view of reality that's fundamentally defective, and they're not aware of it. And this is also being manipulated, so that
without studying history, they're not aware of it.
Well, you look at works on the history of the CIA trying to control what people think, and the ambition of the head of the CIA one stage is to get people to have a false view of reality. And he said that's when we've got that, you've got success. And with the digital technology, it seems as though you've got access to more knowledge, more information or whatever, but there's such a deluge of bits of information that it's so manipulated that people are not able to grasp reality anymore. They've lost connection to reality.
And the CIA is working with university managements to destroy philosophy.
Well, that's right. I mean, the transformation of universities into business corporations, incorporating the most advanced technology, is a way of destroying education, destroying people's capacity to think.
And sort of this gets us to the thinkers like people like Heidegger, for instance, and the problem of, as you say, a problem of technology becoming less and less visible to us. Now, it can come less and less visible to us by people just getting into habits.
Yeah.
But it can also, the problem these days, of course, is the technology becomes so intuitive, so streamlined, that it also becomes invisible to us. It's not like having an old clunky typewriter anymore where the keys get jammed up against each other. And it's moving more towards this, because I've recently encountered a company called the Humane Corporation, which sounds something out of a horrible science fiction novel, like an evil or something out of 1984.
Yeah.
But the Humane Corporation is working on creating sort of an AI link that you just wear on your body somewhere. And you no longer need a screen or keyboards or anything like that. You can just be in permanent sort of communication with this AI. And once you get to technology like that, like the phone is bad enough. Like the phone, as the phenomenologists would argue, the phone, we habituate it. It becomes an extension of our body after a while, and we don't even notice we have it anymore. It's like Heidegger's hammer, with the carpenter with the hammer. But with this sort of technology, it becomes less and less visible. So after a while, we're not even aware that we're using a technology anymore, which then completely destroys our ability to be able to critically reflect on it.
That's right, yeah. And so you dehumanize people. And you enframe the world, the mechanical view of the world, framed it in such a way that you only revealed it as something to be controlled, standing reserved to be exploited. This enframing with digital technology has taken an extreme form of that. So it becomes impossible to think of any other kind of way of thinking. I mean, this way of thinking was defended by Hobbes back in the 17th century, but he could be criticised. Now you've got, and he was criticised. You had a whole tradition of philosophy associated with people like Kant and so on, pointing out the importance of imagination and showing that's a fundamentally flawed characterization of thinking. And the whole development of German philosophy up to phenomenology was highlighting that.
Yeah.
Now, phenomenology has been marginalised, along with philosophy generally, but particularly what they call continental philosophy, and also traditions of thought in Anglophone philosophy, like process philosophy, just totally marginalised. So these people were brilliant thinkers who understood what science was, understood mathematics, were mathematicians themselves to some extent, like Whitehead, Peirce,
Yeah.
Husserl,
Some of the
and
best
so on.
philosophers were, weren't they?
They were, yeah. And so they both appreciated the achievements of mathematics, but also its limitations. So Whitehead talked about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where you mistake your abstractions for concrete reality. It's really useful, but you shouldn't mistake the two. With digital technology, there's a sense in which you've embodied in your technology the abstract thinking that blocks out any sense of the concrete reality.
And it's also from the sort of limited thinking of George Boole.
It is,
You know,
yeah.
it's like it's a highly oversimplified abstract model of reality
That's right.
that you then build your machine, you base your machine on.
Well, even thinking, I mean, when I was a student, we had to study formal logic, and you had to, sort of translate arguments into the kind of digital notation that Boole's logic could deal with. And you realised just how you had to simplify things and blind yourself to context and ignore context. And so you can see how it sometimes illuminates fallacies of thought, but at the same time it blocks out the complexity of things. You can see that, historical arguments just can't be formalised in that way.
Yeah.
Well, the solution they came to was just get rid of those historical contexts and just ignore their reality.
Yeah. I remember a story from Jaron Lanier in his book, You're Not a Gadget, We Are Not a, I think it was We Are Not a Gadget or whatever. He was a Silicon Valley virtual reality pioneer who then started to realise the problems with what he'd created.
Yeah.
But he talked about, I remember him talking about having a roommate who invented MIDI, which was a music producing software. Very early form of, and became the standard in music producing software. But he always complained about it being a very limited form of software because his mate was a bass player. And so once again, there was limited for him. There was a sense of limited imagination.
Yeah.
And then he complains about the fact that you've got all of these MIT graduates spending all of their time making up new emojis.
Yeah.
And engaging in sort of trivial exercises.
Yeah. And you can see the limitations of people's vocabulary on the internet, where they write LOL.
Yes. That's right. I mean, we, as philosophers and as university educators, part of our job is to expand people's vocabularies in order to, help their ability to express themselves as well. But our technologies are interested in, a bit like our old friend Bertrand Russell, technologies are interested in narrowing our range of expression, narrowing our vocabulary.
Yeah.
For the purpose of efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. And people, novelists appreciated this. People like George Orwell in 1984 talking about the need to reduce our vocabulary, to reduce our capacity to think. And Brave New World, Aldous Huxley making the same kind of point. So eliminating the capacity to think about things. And they anticipated this development, which is now taking place.
Well, that was the inspiration to me writing my paper on Society 5.0, which is a new development, an idea coming out of Japan. But but is common amongst most of the developed world in terms of how they can integrate the technologies of, like 5G networks, communication networks, the Internet of Things, what they call Industry 4.0, and also robotics and AI.
Yeah.
So which all brought together creates a system by which you can insert information gathering technology into everything that we engage with every day as human beings. Like even your glass of water could have a chip in it and record how many times you have a glass of water every day and how much water you can. So the idea is everything we will be involved with in a day will be collecting data on us.
Yeah.
It'll be collecting so much data that we won't be able to process it.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to rely on an artificial intelligence to process it.
Mm-hmm.
And the ultimate goal, I suppose, is a bit like in that movie Idiocracy. The ultimate goal is that we'll be able to sit there watching TV on a toilet and have a pizza delivered to us before we even thought of wanting one ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
And some of my students think that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
But, this is ultimately destructive for what we want.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're trying to create intellectual development amongst people, which requires that you're continually confronting intellectual crises and crises in your life more generally, and then overcoming these crises.
Yeah.
And yet our technologists are trying to work towards creating a world where there is no friction, where everything is available to us at the snap of a finger, which ultimately will mean that we won't have to think about anything. And
That's right, yeah.
And politically that will be disastrous because whoever's in charge at the time won't be challenged.
That's right. And then they can say, okay, well, these people are superfluous and we can get rid of them.
Yeah. Unless they need them to buy the technologies.
Yeah. But there could be among these people real environmentalists who think, well, the population's too big. If we just got rid of 6 billion people, and they're pretty hopeless anyway, they're just transforming good energy into heat, get rid of them.
Yeah, the population argument really goes nowhere then, does it?
Yeah.
But what do you think about the idea of, there's a lot of talk now in the face of climate change, for instance. There's a lot about talk now about the need for a technological fix, such as some sort of, putting mirrors in orbit or something like that.
That's right. Well, a whole lot of technological fixes, having electric cars, hydrogen economy and so on. You look at the effects of it, and every so-called advance leads to more greenhouse gas emissions, more environmental destruction. So there's something really wrong about this idea that you can have a technological fix. And it's people are blind to that problematic aspect of things because they've lost the ability to see things in context. But the Scandinavian philosophers in particular have just said, the technological fixes aren't the way to go. Empirical evidence is all against it. In fact, if you look at technology, it turns out, it's supposed to be labour saving, but people have pointed out, particularly in Scandinavia, that if you look at all the labour that goes into everything that's done, there's actually more labour to get particular outputs, except the labour is displaced. It's undertaken by people in developing countries or third world countries. So if you think about anything that appears on our supermarket shelves, the amount of work that's gone into that, as opposed to harvesting things from your garden. It's a massive increase in labour, a massive increase in energy being used, a massive increase in pollution.
Well, look at crypto. Look at the amount of energy and water that gets used in generating the whole crypto scene, currency scene. It always reminds me of, there's a famous Simpsons episode, cartoon episode, where the start of it was quite controversial at the time because of the start of it was the normal beginning of the Simpsons with the family coming in from their car or whatever and sitting down on their couch in their living room. and then it went behind the scenes to the cameraman and the people, whatever, and the sound people and all that, and the producers, whatever. Then it went further behind the scenes, and eventually to some third world country where these people were manually, digging up stuff or whatever. And to generate The Simpsons. So I think a company that Murdoch wasn't too happy with it at the time.
Yeah.
But that's the world we're creating. Isn't it? We're creating a world that's a bit like a Hollywood set.
That's right.
Where you've got, particularly in countries like Australia, where we're very privileged.
Yeah.
And we have this, because we outsourced a lot of our manufacturing many years ago. And so our comfort is always at the expense of millions of people in China or Vietnam or whatever, who get sick and do all the dirty work.
Yeah, that's right.
And have all the pollution. We outsourced our pollution to all these other countries.
As we said before, our phones, which are programmed to wear out very quickly, so that you have to buy a new one, use boron, which is dug up by children in the Congo who get sick because it's poisonous, and they get paid $1 an hour.
Yeah, that's the reality.
That's the reality behind this.
That's disguised,
false reality that the CIA has managed to create in the population.
And the reality, more generally, of course, is that we've got as a result of our technology use and the comforts it brings us, we have chunks of ice falling off the Antarctic, and we have the ocean currents starting to slow, and that's the bigger picture, isn't it?
Yeah, the disaster we're facing, and. It's weird that our print technology and so on has produced stories about this, and it doesn't impact on the population. The population have been insulated from being affected by real discoveries about the real truth of what's going on.
And the thing that I pick up from my students is the way our technological approaches have been habitualized. And it's interesting to see those students who have actually become aware of it, and the change that has gone on with them. And they've, particularly with the phone, they've become aware of just how much of their lives the phone is dominating.
Yeah, and the peculiar thing is that with West being committed to freedom of speech and so on, that some people do study this and get some kind of insight into what's going on, but they're so isolated, there's so few of them, that it doesn't have any impact on the general culture. So the whole society continues moving in the same direction. But the extent to which this false view of reality and false view of what knowledge is, it's actually destroying science itself. Because, as McIntyre pointed out, science presupposes a story about the research traditions that people are engaged in to understand what's been achieved in the past, what the current problems are, and what would be an advance over previous thinking, and also to judge major advances in science, and to then appropriate that and communicate it to the next generation of scientists. But all that's breaking down, and you just get this massive accumulation of trivia produced in more and more scientific journals that are more and more specialized, ignoring each other's work, ignoring advances that invalidate their own research. And so science itself is being destroyed. And that includes, us becoming aware of how destructive we are of the environment, of the rest of nature.
And it's frustrating, isn't it? I wrote an article just recently on what's going on in Gaza. And I was looking at Benjamin Barber's famous book, Jihad versus McWorld, looking at that problem of the relationship between the two sides.
Yeah.
But I was talking about the whole idea of there being people like, why are we surprised by things like this when you can find so many great works by thinkers? Like, even if you look at someone like Marshall McLuhan, who warned us years ago about this was going to happen.
Yeah.
That we would become more and more abstracted from reality. And
that's right,
we would lose sight of the downside of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's right. So Marshall McLuhan complimented Walter Ong, these brilliant thinkers, but with this incredible mass production of new books, whatever, these great thinkers just get buried. So
through more efficient technologies.
That's right. So later thinkers, later academics, just seem unaware of the insights achieved in the past.
Yep.
There's no proper transmission of insights and wisdom from generation to generation. This is what universities should be understood to be, sort of upholding and developing their culture and passing it on from one generation to the next. Instead, it's been redefined as storing and processing information, perhaps training people so that they can be able to make more money. But that doesn't work very well because, the constant changes in technology renders their skills obsolete within a few years.
That's right. Yeah.
So what you find is these supposed advances in technology are just rendering people's lives worse and worse. The more economically insecure, unable to buy houses, that kind of thing. So you get this, and the distortion of our understanding of reality is just so incredible. The people are enduring all this despite the evidence in their own lives, but they don't seem to be able to relate their own lives to the abstractions that they're being informed with.
Well, that's what the technology is doing. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? Is that I never the technology creates us in the image of the machine, and we start to follow the logic of the machine. Whereas a lot of it at the time, that is at odds with what people are actually like, or what people actually want.
Yeah.
But they follow this logic until such time as they are made aware of it.
Yeah.
And are sort of horrified by what it's done to them.
Yeah. One of the things that I read when I was a student was Tales of Nasruddin, which is really interesting because it's an Islamic text, a really old text.
Oh.
And one of the stories was about a mullah coming to a village and saying, I can teach anyone to read. And so one guy steps up and says, teach me to read, and he casts a spell and he races off. Then he comes back and says, where is that fraud? And they said, why, can't you read? He said, yeah, I can read all right. But the book I read said that all mullahs are fakes.
Well, reading's very dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's this people just ignoring their own experiences and accepting the official view of what reality is.
I know, and it's particularly tense within medical science and medical technology as well. It's about where are the benefits of medical technology, and to what extent does medical technology then interfere with us going through more natural processes of looking after ourselves and our immune systems, etc. To what extent? I have many friends, for instance, who, from an ethical perspective, I have several friends who lived lifestyles of drinking and smoking, and got to an age where, not feeling too good, have a stent put in their heart, and and off they go. You can do it again now, or they've had some, great awakening and change their habits. But there's this sense in which people can be compensated for their bad behaviour through our technology in many ways, which always is a problem for me.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And it's more cost in terms of not just labour, but also impact on the environment.
That's right. I actually wrote about that in a paper of mine about the actual impact on the environment that modern technology was having. So at the same time as we're saving a handful of relatively affluent people, we're destroying lives for most.
That's right, yeah.
But what about, I guess, also a sort of a utilitarian approach to this in terms of how we use technology, just purely as a means to an end. Once again, I think that's that problem with the instrumental view, isn't it? That we just see a machine as being a means to an end, and we don't appreciate the impacts, the broader impacts that it's having on us.
Well, even in relation to work, so you supposedly make work easier by new forms of technology, and you destroy craftsmanship. So you look at the modern furniture. There's no craftsmanship left. There's no carpenters who select the right timber according to its grain. and produce things that last hundreds of years. You get wood chipping, moulding these things into the right shape, glued together with glue that gives off these fumes that are carcinogenic. And
I like the
IKEA.
the bench. I like the kitchen benches. You know, that have been killing people. The silica.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have this strange subculture emerging from this, where you've got all these people going out and growing their little gardens out their back, or going to their little sheds to make a table or something, as a sort of as a reaction against this.
The importance of just craftsmanship and trying to actually produce something and having a sense of having produced something through their craftsmanship, but that's being eliminated. So you can see that this is extending now into universities. The idea that academics don't need good knowledge; they just need to know how to manipulate the technology, download stuff from the internet, and process it, and feed the right stuff to their students using the most advanced technology, effectively eliminating most academics with all the work that they used to do.
And it's the problem also of uploading your knowledge and experience onto the internet, for instance, or as data that anyone can access, which on the surface sounds like a really good thing. But the experience that people have of accessing that data is not the same as the experience of learning from someone's wisdom.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and,
so you can see
in the process you make yourself redundant as well.
Yeah, so you can see this absurdity in what's happening in universities at present. But the point about technology is that it's always tended to be like that. Once you overcome this fetishism of technology or the machine, you can see, well, what kind of technology is embraced. The people in positions of power are always trying to undermine the power of the people that they dominate.
Yeah.
So the development of the steam engine and so on, the concentration of workers into factories and the like, wasn't more efficient. Previously, people had to live near streams where you could harness the flowing water, and they were more efficient than the people who were using these steam engines. But the steam engines, by bringing people together, made them more exploitable and disempowered them. And the so-called progress that took place in the time wasn't associated with being more productive, it was being more exploited, the vast majority of the population being more exploited. So the working class life expectancy dropped dramatically. So back in 1900 it was, or 1800 it was 18, a working class family. That was their life expectancy. Later on, it improved because the British learnt how to exploit people in other countries and exterminate the populations of those countries, like in Australia.
Well, longevity is a great example, isn't it, of where are we going with this? Developing technologies that can help extend our lifespan.
Yeah, well, you can see where it's going.
Yeah.
One of the Rockefellers lived to 100 and something, 5 or something, but he got there by having 8 heart transplants.
8?
Yeah. We now have, people in India selling their kidneys to people in affluent countries. In the future, you can imagine how, affluent people won't want to bear children, so they'll pay other people to do it for them.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, if you give blood transfusions to old animals from young animals, they'll revive and be healthier. So you can imagine in the future, poor people will be harvested for their blood to extend the lifespan of these super affluent people.
Well, this gets to the core, I guess, of what our critique of modern technology is, isn't it? I mean, it really comes back, as we talked about in our last session, it really comes back to those ethical questions.
It does, yeah.
About what is a good life,
and how it should be lived, and how we can organise society so that people can live the good life.
And who are these technologies actually serving? Whose interests are they actually serving?
Yeah.
And
what the alternatives could be. I mean, the trouble is that we have not even permitted to do the work required to think about the alternatives.
Or the downsides. I mean,
The
because you get, as you say, you get like a cargo cult. You get like a cult-like following of these modern technologies, and everyone has to become integrated into them. And so people like us who sort of apocalyptic and sit on the outside a little bit are seen as threats to these developing technologies.
Yeah. And if you think about people like Marshall McLuhan and Walter Ong, they didn't condemn the more recent technological developments, the technologization of the word, but they argued that you shouldn't be dominated by it, which means that you should utilize these things, but utilize all the different facets of communication. And that's, I think, what's really important, to recover that sense of being grounded in reality, making sure that we're not dominated by these fetishized institutions, ways of thinking, tools.
Well, that's my message, I think, at the end of the Philosophy Media Culture course, is that having understood the impacts that different technologies have on you, the way they affect you in different ways, the things that they enhance and the things that they destroy, the importance of actually, engaging with a range of different technologies, different mediums, for instance, of different experiences, not becoming totally dependent on one thing.
And if you think about Walter Ong's work or Hobart and Schiffman's works, by virtue of producing these histories showing how different ways of thinking developed, they facilitate, not being dominated by abstractions, by overcoming fetishism. But what's happening with the marginalization and the elimination of the humanities, both history and philosophy, is that people aren't able to develop those perspectives anymore. So you get this one-dimensional way of thinking that Marcuse talked about, but in a much more extreme form than what he was complaining about.
A world of the integrated.
Totally integrated into this scheme of things. And, you now get surveillance technology based on information technology, digital technology, monitoring everything that people do, trying to control everything, although not being all that successful because you get people just going haywire as a consequence of that.
Well, that's so un-Aristotelian too, isn't it? From an ethics perspective, the idea that, and also very Hobbesian, the idea that we no longer trust any other human being around us. We've lost our trust in each other.
Yeah, and you don't need to develop people. That's the initial understanding of what education or paideia was all about, so that they be self-constraining, committed to working for the common good and getting fulfillment through that. You eliminate that. You don't need the development of character anymore.
No.
You just need people who can be consumers and cogs.
Yeah, and a monitoring system to keep them, and the threat, the continual threat of that everything you're doing is being watched.
That's right. It's a surveillance society. Yeah.
Sounds a bit like George Orwell, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, this is what utilitarians were arguing. Bentham developing the idea of the panopticon, the prison where people were constantly under observation, and they couldn't be sure when they were being observed. So they always felt that they were under observation, and by virtue of that, their conformity would become habitual. Well, that's what we've created. A society where everyone is surveilled all the time. Through the internet, you can be monitored. Your emails can be monitored. You don't know what's going on. The computer chips are designed to facilitate that monitoring. That's what Snowden was complaining about when he fled to Russia.
Oh yeah. There just seems to be a complete lack of irony, doesn't there?
Oh, that's right. Well, you can't have irony when you're just an information processing mechanism.
I even wonder whether, some of these philosophers themselves, like even Bentham or someone like Bentham was a humanitarian and egalitarian, and you wonder whether they, what the hell have they done with my theory? It was a joke. It was a joke. It was a joke. And that we've just taken it to the extreme. We didn't get the joke.
Yeah.
And it's like when a student reads Brave New World or whatever, and they say,
Yeah.
"Gee, that looks pretty good.
Yeah.
I'd love to live there."
That's right. Well, Brave New World, if you think about it, is one of the most important critiques of utilitarianism, because this is where you end up. And he shows that it's not a utopia, it's a dystopia. Some people might think that that's great, but I think that when most students read it, they think there's something problematic here. The problem is that those kind of books, which people who were studying literature had to read, have been shunted aside.
And the importance of that novel too is that you have a group of elites at the top who are seemingly in control of it all and are ironically detached from it in that sense. But they themselves are controlled, aren't they, by a machine?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so prescient of what such a bad idea, and yet here we are.
That's right.
Yeah.
Despite that, people didn't react against it.
Yep. So, all right. Have we solved that problem too, have we? Of technology? Where do we go from here, Arran?
We actually have to get down to practice and practice a different way of living. And that's not going to be easy. And if you try to do that, you realize just how oppressive society really is. This society that's supposedly empowering people all the time to make them freer, more democratic, has actually destroyed freedom and democracy.
Yeah, the ways in which you have these technologies often producing the reverse or the negative of what they're supposed to do.
That's right, yeah.
And
and then using vocabulary in a way that inverts everything. So freedom or slavery is defined as freedom, just like in 1984.
But I guess there's a sort of a word that's become a cliche these days is the word mindfulness. I mean, or in philosophy, it's the idea of living a thoughtful life, a self-reflective life, and mindfulness is a word that's associated with that as well. And so,
yeah, well, that's what the Zen Buddhists sort of try to cultivate, which I think has got some important aspects to it. And you can see that the people who wander around with their phones in their hands, being oblivious to their surroundings, they've just completely lost that.
And it's important that people know that when they're engaging with their phone, that they're actually engaging with the mind of someone like George Boole, and that they're they know that history, they know where it came from, they know the characters who invented them and the motivations behind inventing them, and also the ways in which they were commercialized in various ways. And then with that knowledge, hopefully then they can develop a much more mature relationship with any machine they engage with, and not be overawed by it as well. I always love telling the story of when I took my daughter to her first IMAX movie, 3D IMAX movie.
Oh, yeah.
And we had to put these huge big goggles on, and we're watching this underwater adventure, and my daughter's reaching up and touching the sharks, and all the octopuses and all that sort of thing. She's going, "Oh wow, Dad!" She's going, "Look, it's 3D, Dad, 3D." And I said, "Yeah." And being a philosopher, I said, "Yeah, it's great, isn't it?" I said, "Do you want to see real 3D?" She said, "Oh yeah, it's real 3D." I said, "Yeah, what do I do?" I said, "Take your glasses off." Because we have these senses, we see 3D all the time.
Yeah.
So I think as you develop a more knowledge and understanding of technology, you don't get as overawed by it. Sometimes you think, well, geez, organic life is incredible compared to this.
It is,
so many of our technologies are actually simplistic in relation to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an appreciation I think we've lost.
That's right. And that's what life is, much more complex than anything that can be modelled in a machine.
Yeah, well, modelling, that's another story, isn't it? It's based on simplistic modelling. Oh, well, thanks, Arran.
Oh, thank you.
That was good. Enjoyed it. So if you've been listening and watching the Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast, today we've been talking about technology, and we'll see you again.